They didn't have much, but they had fire in their stoves and fight in their hearts. In the silence of boarded-up factories. In homes where shoes were patched and dreams were rationed. Mothers turned scraps into supper and hunger into invention. This isn't just food history. This is the story of how America cooked its way through despair. From milk toast that soothed shivering mornings, to water pies that defied logic, and fried bologna that sizzled like hope in a skillet. Every bite was a quiet act of rebellion, a way to say, we will survive this together. And if you've ever tasted sugar on warm cornbread, you know they weren't just feeding bellies. They were feeding the soul. This is the food that built endurance. This is the forgotten feast of the Great Depression. Before sugary cereals and toaster pastries, there was something far more humble, far more human. Toast. A bowl of warm milk, gently poured over toasted bread. Sweetened if you were lucky, seasoned only by the silence of hard times. During the Great Depression, this wasn't just breakfast. It was a symbol of survival in a world turned upside down. When cupboards echoed and coins clinked hollow in tin jars, milk toast was how working-class families told their children, "You're still safe. You're still loved." It wasn't fancy. Just day-old bread, browned in a pan or under the flame. A splash of milk, sometimes warm, sometimes barely enough. If a mother could spare it, a dusting of sugar or cinnamon made it feel like dessert. In some homes, milk was so scarce, they poured hot coffee instead. Imagine that, the bitterness of coffee softening stale toast. And somehow, it felt like comfort. Author M.F.K. Fisher once called it a source of moral and physical strength. And she was right. Because milk toast didn't fill a plate. It filled a purpose. It was served on cold mornings when the coal had run low. When the woodpile was down to splinters. Children, wrapped in threadbare coats, sat at kitchen tables lit by hope and habit. They spooned up the warmth. Not just to feed their stomachs, but to quiet their fears. And what's remarkable? Ask anyone who grew up on it. They don't describe it with shame. They describe it with nostalgia, like it was a hug from their mother in a cracked porcelain bowl. Because when all the world was crumbling, milk toast held just enough together to make it to the next day. So no, it wasn't gourmet, but it was dignity, served hot, with nothing but love. In the Great Depression, steak was a fantasy, a holiday miracle. But there was one thing you could still hear sizzling in the skillet: fried bologna. Cheap, salty, and sold by the slice, bologna was the working man's meat. And when it hit a hot pan, it transformed from cold lunch meat into something almost sacred, a meal with warmth, aroma, and dignity. In coal towns of Pennsylvania, across the Appalachian foothills, this sandwich became legend. Mothers would take thick slices of bologna, sometimes scored at the edges to keep them from curling, and lay them flat in old cast-iron pans. The sound? A sharp hiss. The smell? Smoky, meaty. Kids would gather near the stove, watching the edges bubble and crisp like a promise. There might be no roast tonight, but there'd be hot meat, and that meant something. Placed between slices of white bread, sometimes buttered, sometimes toasted on the same skillet, it was more than a sandwich. It was survival disguised as supper. When eggs were on hand, a fried egg would stretch it into what some called the poor man's deluxe. Others added onions or a swipe of mustard, anything to remind the family that flavor was still possible, even now. And for children coming home from school, with empty bellies and heavier worries, a fried bologna sandwich meant relief, not just from hunger, but from the weight of the world. It was salty, greasy, comforting. It stuck to your ribs and told you, we made it through another day. For many Depression-era families, it was the closest they'd get to steak for years. And yet, they don't speak of it with pity. They remember it with warmth. The smell, the sizzle, the way the edges curled like petals in a skillet. It's not just food, it's a memory seared into time. Fried bologna, crisped by hardship, served with love. In the 1930s, desserts didn't come in boxes. There were no candy aisles to wander through, no birthday cakes stacked with frosting. But there was still sweetness. and it lived between two slices of bread. Sugar sandwiches. To us today, it might seem strange. But to a child of the Great Depression, it was magic. A slice of bread, usually a bit stale, a thin layer of butter or lard, and then a delicate snowfall of sugar, carefully spread like it was gold dust. That was it. No sprinkles. No chocolate. Just love, served simple. You see, sugar was rationed. Butter was precious. And real desserts? Unthinkable for many working-class families. So when a mother spared even a spoonful of sugar for a sandwich, she wasn't just feeding a child. She was offering a moment of joy. It was usually eaten slowly. First bite crisp with sugar crystals, then soft as it melted into the bread. A texture you don't forget. A flavor tied forever to the face of someone who cared enough to make it. Sometimes it was just one slice, folded in half. Other times, an open-faced piece, waiting on a chipped enamel plate. No matter how it looked, it felt like a treat. Children who hadn't seen a candy bar in years would carry these in their school lunches with quiet pride. Not because it was fancy, but because it was theirs. In some homes, this was dessert. In others, it was dinner when meat ran out and pennies had to stretch. But no matter the reason, the sugar sandwich wasn't just about taste. It was about care. A mother's hand, a father's last bit of rationed sweetness. A small rebellion against bitterness. Ask anyone who grew up on them. They don't remember the hunger as much as they remember that sandwich, and the way it made them feel seen, cherished, and safe. Sugar sandwiches. Proof that love doesn't need frosting. Sometimes, it only needs a little sugar, and someone willing to give it. Before Cheerios, before Frosted Flakes, breakfast in America had no box, no mascot, no cartoon on the side. It came in a chipped bowl, filled with yesterday's leftovers and this morning's hope. Cornbread and milk. It was the working-class cereal. A Great Depression classic, born from necessity but served with love. When dinner scraps became breakfast blessings, families took what they had, cold cornbread from the night before, crumbled it by hand, and poured warm milk over top. That was it. No sugar unless you could spare it. No fruit unless the season had been kind. But what it lacked in ingredients, it made up for in comfort. For children waking up in drafty houses, where the floorboards were colder than the outside wind, this bowl of creamy, soft golden bread was the closest thing to warmth they'd feel all morning. It was filling. It was familiar. And most importantly, it was enough. Mothers would stir the pot quietly at dawn, warming milk over a stove that barely had fire left in it. Sometimes the cornbread floated in big chunks. Sometimes it was mashed to a porridge. Either way, it did the job. The cornmeal gave energy. The milk gave calcium. And the memory? That lasted a lifetime. In many homes, this was the only breakfast that ever showed up. There were no pancakes, no bacon, no eggs sizzling in a pan. But there was always this. A bowl of something warm. A sign that you hadn't been forgotten. And it wasn't just food. There was a rhythm of making do, making it stretch, making it matter. To this day, those who grew up on it still remember the texture, the softness, the way it soaked up the milk, and the quiet moment at the table when everything felt okay, just for a few bites. Cornbread and milk. It didn't cost much. But in the Great Depression, it meant everything. When you hear the name water pie, it almost sounds like a joke, like something out of a fairy tale where the cupboard is empty and hope is the last ingredient. But in reality, water pie was no joke. It was a culinary miracle born of desperation and a mother's determination. During the darkest years of the Great Depression, when families couldn't spare a single egg and milk was reserved for the very young, women across America still found a way to bring dessert to the table. And that's when water pie appeared. Imagine it, a crust lined with nothing more than water, flour, sugar, butter, and maybe a splash of vanilla extract, if you were lucky. No eggs, no milk, just the absolute basics. But here's where the ingenuity shines. As it bakes, something magical happens. The water binds with the flour and sugar, the butter melts into richness, and together, they form a custard-like filling, smooth, sweet, and shockingly satisfying. It was kitchen chemistry that didn't require a science degree, just patience, an oven, and a fierce refusal to let hard times steal every last comfort. Mothers served water pie not because they had nothing left, but because they still had love to give. For children who hadn't seen cake or pie in months, that wobbly, golden slice was more than dessert. It was proof that sweetness still existed in the world, even when everything else seemed bitter. It didn't cost much, but it meant everything. And today, if you've ever tasted it, or even heard about it, you're not just biting into a pie. You're tasting the determination of a generation that refused to let poverty erase joy. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with a side. But for thousands of American families in the 1930s, and still well into the 1950s, the poor man's meal was survival, hot, hearty, and made with whatever you had left. 3 ingredients. That's all it took: potatoes, hot dogs, and onions. Nothing fancy. No herbs, no spices. Just staples, because that's all families could afford. And somehow it worked. First came the potatoes, peeled, chopped, and fried in lard or bacon grease until golden brown and crispy on the edges. Onions were sliced thin and tossed into the pan, caramelizing slowly, filling the kitchen with a scent that made your stomach growl. Then came the hot dogs, cheap, easy to find, and full of flavor when fried. Sliced into coins, browned alongside the onions and potatoes, they added that salty, smoky taste that turned scraps into a full meal. Drive-ins didn't serve this. You wouldn't find it on a menu. But in homes across America, especially among working-class and immigrant families, this dish showed up again and again. Because it was filling, because it was fast, and because it meant everyone got something on their plate. Kids loved it. Adults depended on it. And even now, when people recreate it, it doesn't taste poor. It tastes honest, humble, real. In a world where food has become complicated, this dish reminds us that sometimes the most comforting meals are the ones that started from struggle. And maybe that's the richest flavor of all. At first glance, a lard sandwich might sound like the punchline to a bad joke. But in the hungry years of the Great Depression, it was no joke at all. It was survival spread between 2 slices of bread. Butter was a luxury, a memory. But lard, soft, white, and scraped from the last bits of bacon or rendered from leftover pork fat, was the one thing many families still had. And so, it became lunch. It became dinner. It became the thing that kept children standing on long walks to school and through hours of chores. There was no recipe. Just one slice of homemade bread, sometimes stale, always precious, spread with a thick layer of lard. That was it. Some days, if you were lucky, there'd be a dash of salt. On Sundays, maybe even a sprinkle of sugar. That turned it into dessert. But what this meal lacked in ingredients, it made up for in calories and in care. Parents knew kids needed fat to grow, to think, to work. Lard delivered. It was the unsung hero of rural pantries, especially in the South and the Midwest, where families stretched every scrap into sustenance. To modern tastes, it might seem unthinkable. But for the children who ate it, quietly, gratefully, it was a reminder that someone still loved them enough to put something on their bread. And that's the hidden beauty of lard sandwiches. They weren't just about feeding the body. They were about feeding hope, one bite at a time. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't pretty. But in the 1930s, Hoover's stew filled bellies when nothing else would. Named not with affection, but with bitter irony, after President Herbert Hoover, the stew became a staple in American homes and soup kitchens during the Great Depression. For families who felt abandoned by leadership and crushed by unemployment, this stew was a way to survive and to speak a quiet kind of protest with their spoons. The ingredients? Whatever you had. Usually elbow macaroni, sliced hot dogs, stewed tomatoes, and canned corn or peas. Shelf-stable. Stretchable. It wasn't just a recipe, it was a lifeline. Mothers would boil pasta, slice up hot dogs, the cheapest meat you could buy, and mix in whatever vegetables were around, fresh or canned. The result simmered in one pot, easy to make and easy to stretch. Feed 5? Sure. Feed 10? Just add more water. It didn't win any culinary awards. But it didn't need to. Because it worked. In crowded tenements and rural cabins, the smell of Hoover's stew meant dinner was happening. It meant that, even without money, there was something warm on the table. And here's the remarkable part: families shared it. Neighbors would toss their ingredients into the pot, creating a stew of necessity and of community. It wasn't just food. It was a symbol of resilience, of creativity, of turning disappointment into dinner. And for the children who grew up eating it, Hoover's stew didn't just fill their stomachs. It taught them that even in the hardest times, people found a way to care for each other. Now here's a Depression-era dish that feels like a magic trick: apple pie, with no apples. Just crackers. It's called mock apple pie, and it was born out of pure desperation and brilliant kitchen science. When apples became too expensive or unavailable during the Great Depression, resourceful home cooks did the unthinkable. They turned to Ritz crackers. Yes, crackers. The recipe first appeared in the 1930s, and what it accomplished was stunning. Housewives discovered that by layering Ritz crackers with sugar, cinnamon, and lemon juice, and baking them inside a pie crust, they could mimic the taste and texture of apple pie so convincingly that even seasoned bakers were fooled. The secret? It's in the texture. When baked in syrupy lemon sugar, the crackers soften just enough to feel like cooked apples. And the hint of salt from the crackers? It actually enhances the sweetness, creating a depth of flavor you'd swear came from fruit. For families who hadn't tasted a real apple in months, this pie was more than a dessert. It was a reminder of better days. It gave the illusion of abundance when ingredients were scarce. And it was cheap. Ritz crackers were introduced in 1934 as an affordable luxury. They gave this dish its signature feel: crumbly, soft, and just tart enough to pass for the real thing. Mock apple pie is one of those recipes that proves a simple truth: taste is memory. And even when resources were low, American families found ways to create joy from almost nothing. If you've never tried it, you might laugh at the idea. But just one bite, and you'll understand why this became a beloved classic in the hardest of times. It sounds absurd. Tomato soup in a cake? But in the depths of the Great Depression, this dish wasn't just a strange experiment, it was a triumph of resourceful baking. Known simply as tomato soup cake, it was a sweet, spiced dessert that used one of the most unexpected pantry items of the 1930s, Campbell's canned tomato soup. No butter, no eggs, no milk. Just soup, flour, sugar, and a handful of warm spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. You see, during those lean years, families had to make do without the usual luxuries of baking. But tomato soup, shelf-stable and cheap, offered something magical. It acted as both the liquid and binder in a cake batter. And thanks to the natural pectin in tomatoes, it created a dense, moist texture that actually worked. The first time you mix it, it looks like a mistake. But as it bakes, something incredible happens. The tomato flavor vanishes completely. In its place, a warm, aromatic spice cake that felt like a holiday treat, no matter the day. This cake offered more than calories. It gave families celebration during hardship. A slice of this unusual dessert meant someone took the time to measure, stir, and bake, even when there was nothing extra to spare. The recipe stuck around too. It became a community favorite at potlucks, church suppers, and post-war kitchens, cherished not just for its flavor, but for what it symbolized. A reminder that even in the harshest times, sweetness could still be found and created, with nothing more than a little canned soup and a lot of heart. It might sound like a dare. Peanut butter and mayonnaise? In the same sandwich? But for many working-class Americans during the Great Depression, this odd couple wasn't just a meal, it was a lifeline. In the 1930s, families clung to foods that were cheap, shelf-stable, and filling. Peanut butter was a nutritional powerhouse, packed with protein and healthy fats. Mayonnaise, tangy and rich, added calories and moisture that stretched a simple sandwich into something that stuck to your ribs. Together, it worked. Surprisingly well. This wasn't some bizarre food trend, it was survival. Every ingredient had to matter. And when you didn't have meat, or cheese, or even jelly, you used what you had. Peanut butter gave strength. Mayonnaise made it go down easier. It was practical and, for some, comforting. Families passed the recipe around, especially in the South and Midwest. Some added lettuce for crunch. Others toasted the bread. But at its heart, this was about resourcefulness. It filled lunch pails. It carried children through school days. It kept bellies from rumbling on nights when the cupboards were nearly bare. For many Depression-era kids, the taste of this sandwich is burned into memory, not as strange or gross, but as something mom made with love when options ran out. It's a reminder that when times get tough, people get creative. And even two unlikely ingredients can come together to do something extraordinary. So the next time you wrinkle your nose at the idea, remember, it wasn't about flavor. It was about fuel and family and getting through the day. They called it resource. Some said it meant save our stomachs. Others? Well, let's just say the second wasn't quite so polite. But to struggling families during the Great Depression, this salty, creamy dish meant one thing. You were going to bed with something warm in your belly. Chipped beef on toast, also called creamed dried beef, wasn't fancy, but it worked. It started with dried beef, sold in glass jars or paper packets, often the cheapest meat you could buy. It was sliced thin and salty enough to last forever. That beef got tossed into a skillet with a roux, flour, fat, and milk to make a thick white gravy. Then it was ladled over toast, any bread you had, creating a dish that was savory, filling, and deeply comforting. This wasn't just dinner, it was survival disguised as a meal. For families scraping by, chipped beef gave the illusion of abundance. It made a little meat stretch across many plates. The toast soaked up the sauce, and the salty beef made every bite feel satisfying, even if there was hardly any protein on the plate. And for many kids, it became a memory, the smell of it bubbling on the stove, the clink of spoons scraping every drop from the plate. The dish even followed men into the military. During World War II, it became a staple in mess halls, feeding thousands of soldiers with ingredients that were cheap, shelf-stable, and hard to mess up. So yes, it was resource, but not because it was a joke. Because it showed up right when you needed it most. It doesn't get simpler than this. 2 slices of bread, a scoop of beans, maybe a slice of tomato if you were lucky. But during the Great Depression, bean sandwiches weren't just a cheap lunch. They were a miracle of nourishment and ingenuity. With meat far too expensive for most working-class families, beans became the go-to protein. Navy beans, pinto beans, or black-eyed peas, whatever was available and affordable, were cooked down slowly, sometimes seasoned with onions, bacon grease, or just salt when that's all there was. Leftovers from dinner? That became tomorrow's sandwich. Mothers would mash the beans gently, spread them thick onto slices of homemade bread, often dry and dense from rationed ingredients, and add whatever extras they had. A slice of onion, a bit of lettuce, or even a dollop of mustard if they could spare it. It wasn't gourmet, but it filled bellies, and it gave children enough energy to get through school and long afternoons of chores. And it wasn't just about survival. These sandwiches carried the silent message. I'm doing the best I can with what we have. In dusty lunch pails across the Midwest, in tin school boxes on southern farms, bean sandwiches kept a generation going. For many who grew up in the 1930s, they were more than a meal. They were a symbol of resilience. Today, we might overlook them. But back then, a bean sandwich meant another day endured, and maybe a better one on the way. It started with a pot of boiling water and a scoop of cornmeal. But to families in the Great Depression, cornmeal mush was more than just food. It was a survival strategy dressed up as comfort. At its core, mush was simple: cornmeal, water, salt. But what it became, that depended on what you had and what you could stretch. For breakfast, it was served hot in a bowl, smooth, creamy, with a splash of milk and maybe a drizzle of molasses or syrup. If sweeteners were scarce, it was eaten plain, warming hands and bellies alike during cold mornings with little heat. But the real magic came the next day. Leftover mush was poured into loaf pans to cool and solidify. Then it was sliced and fried in bacon grease, lard, or whatever fat was available. The result? Golden, crispy slabs that sizzled in the pan and brought a touch of joy to otherwise meager meals. Families ate it at any time of day: breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Some paired it with beans, others with fried eggs, and some ate it with nothing at all. What made cornmeal mush so vital wasn't just its versatility. It was how it stretched a small bag of meal into several meals, how it filled hungry stomachs, provided energy for the day's labor, and turned scarcity into something that actually tasted good. This wasn't just food. This was the art of making do, with grit, grace, and just enough cornmeal to carry you to tomorrow. They couldn't afford butter. Eggs were saved for special occasions. And sugar, well, that was rationed with care. But somehow they still made cake. During the Great Depression, families discovered how to create sweetness out of almost nothing. This was the birth of what we now call Twinkie-style depression cake, a soft, spongy dessert made without milk, eggs, or butter. Flour, brown sugar, baking soda, vinegar. Mix it all together, and something unexpected happened. The vinegar reacted with the baking soda, creating rise. The sugar added moisture and caramel tones. It wasn't rich, but it was soft, tender, and just sweet enough to feel like a treat. These cakes were sometimes wrapped in wax paper, tucked into lunch pails, or saved for Sunday supper. And every bite was a reminder that even in the darkest days, joy still had a place at the table. Twinkie-style cakes weren't just desserts. They were proof that with enough creativity and a whole lot of heart, you could still celebrate the little things. Still bake. Still smile. Still share something sweet with the ones you love. If this journey through Depression-era cooking reminded you of your grandparents, or maybe even your own childhood, backhand index pointing right, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your story in the comments. Because these recipes aren't just food, they're family history. And keeping them alive? That's something worth cooking for.